Hello, folks. Welcome back to Management 5804, Leadership and Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend, and this will be lecture 7.1. And in this lecture, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about S-curve strategies. And so by way of recap here, we spent the first part of the semester talking about the challenges that disruptive innovations as a form of competitive dynamics creates for firms in implementing and successfully pursuing technology strategy. And so disruptive innovations, as we know, oftentimes occur when companies are really at their peak, when they're performing most effectively within the markets that they've chosen. And so if those industry offerings have been steadily improving for a long period of time, customers think that some of the old versions are good enough, and the company continues to invest in sustaining innovations to improve the product. If the product itself requires substantial skill or effort, right, or it's so well customized to customer needs that it's missing out on some key components, then that can generate pockets of customers who don't utilize the product or service. And within that, if there are multiple ways to disaggregate or modularize the product, right, if we can pull out features and focus on some of these pockets of customers who aren't utilizing it, and and pinpointing specific things that they need, that creates an opportunity for disruptive innovations to pursue or to enter into our market. And so we talked about the role of the extendable core, or the role of disruptors, attackers' advantages, and being able to climb from the fringes of our market into the mainstream. And so our goal here today in these two lectures for this first unit is to talk more specifically about S-curve strategies, but think about them now more from the perspective of customers. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about what incumbents and new entrants do, but what are customers thinking during this process? And how do their thought processes and preferences and expectations and buying decisions shape the emergence of new product categories and new innovations? And so, again, technology strategy itself is built around the logic of an S-curve, and so now we want to think about the role of customers in yielding these patterns of diffusion, or how a product itself spreads through a market. And so we talked about Netflix and Blockbuster as a kind of a core case for us when we thought about disruptive innovations, and we raised the argument that the story was a lot more complicated than people typically assumed. So it wasn't this kind of simple story of Netflix disrupting Blockbuster, and Blockbuster, as the old dinosaur, wasn't able to keep up with the new changes. And as we kind of look at the S-curve here, we recognize that that's not necessarily an accurate picture of what happened. We talked specifically about the role of Redbox in really eliminating Blockbuster's opportunity to pursue that dual transformation. So we ended our disruption unit thinking about the challenges of an incumbent trying to maintain its superiority or improve its positioning in the legacy market while it attempts to address or pursue an opportunity with a new disruptive innovation. But again, the underlying pattern of how these products spread is this S-curve. And so it's crucial for us to now, again, understand some strategic questions and then roll in or to link in the role of the customers and how the S-curve is structured. And so within that, the S-curve itself is clearly driving some of these patterns that we're seeing with disruptive innovations. And so we talked about disruptive innovations, again, emerging really at the fringes of a market and with a limited set of customers. And the product itself oftentimes doesn't work very effectively, doesn't necessarily have the right features in order to reach mainstream customers. But in that, as it gains traction over time, it's able to climb into those mainstream markets in order to disrupt an incumbent. Within that, again, the underlying pattern of an S-curve explains why we have some of these dynamics, why firms struggle, oftentimes even new entrants struggle with a disruptive innovation up front, and it's not quite as inevitable as sometimes we typically assume. And so, again, the real challenge, though, for firms is that disruptive innovations create this kind of step change, or this paradigm shift as we move from one S-curve to another. Right? So we're thinking about one type of technological platform moving to a new type of technology platform. And so understanding these dynamics are going to be crucial for us as we start to think about it. And so the question is, again, we think about it from the perspective of customers, is how do these innovations, again, they seem to follow this pattern of an S-curve in quite a few different markets, but how do they spread? Right? What are the factors that cause these technologies to gain traction with customers? And so you can see here that, again, the S-curves themselves, there's error and variance, so to speak, in how these product categories emerge. But you can see oftentimes some pretty flat growth followed by a pretty massive set of or exponential growth, right? So it kind of reflects this S-curve pattern, and then eventually it dies out. And so if we were looking at different product classes and we were trying to think of the number of customers who use, again, our y-axis here is just percent penetration, so it's not something that can decline in numbers per se. But the specifics, well, I guess it can, but the specifics here are that these are just charting the emergence of these categories. But that S-curve itself, again, follows this pattern of flat early growth and then some really long-term massive changes that after it goes through kind of an exponential period of growth. And so we can see that across the different categories. But the question is why, right? What drives, from a customer perspective, these technologies to diffuse in this pattern? Are there limits to it, right? Is there just one pattern of growth, right? Are there specific ways in which you could have multiple product categories kind of trying to attack the same space all at the same time? And again, the challenges with an S-curve are pretty daunting for companies, because now they've got to take into account specifically how to respond to some of the timing issues that emerge as the market and the products themselves are starting to spread and diffuse. And so, again, within an S-curve of innovation, what's critical here is that, the nature of the innovation itself is starting to change. And so early on, again, you're seeing a technology emerge with a lot of hype around it. And in the future lectures, we'll talk about the Gartner hype cycle. So it's not necessarily something that has a lot of rigorous, development behind it, but it's a pattern that the Gartner Group uses to chart new emerging technologies. And what it really shows is that early on, expectations get too inflated. And so we think about, oh, this new technology is going to be amazing. It's going to completely change the world. And then, people start to use it and they're like, okay, what's the big deal? It works pretty well, but there's still a lot of kinks in it. Maybe it doesn't work as well as we expect. And so this kind of overestimation of what a technology can do creates problems early on for companies. But then over time, as it starts to spread, that technology again starts to reach some limits on how effective it can actually be, and again, firms stop investing and really break through innovations here, and the pace of innovation starts to slow down as companies start to invest in sustaining innovations. And here, the S-curve itself kind of sometimes underestimates, because companies get more conservative as they move into these mainstream markets. And so that oftentimes is what opens up the opportunity for firms to start to disrupt with something brand new, because there aren't specific needs being met, and the company's not necessarily riding the technology, the new technology wave that's emerging. And so as the reading talks about, right, this S-curve is this diffusion pattern that seems ubiquitous, but it charts really how price performance growth changes and impacts customer adoption. And so the critical thing here is that it gives us a set of sequential strategic problems. And so we've talked about these within the context of disruptive innovations, and now we're going to look at it really from the perspective of customers and how that really shapes fundamentally how the firms start to approach these product design and business model development. And so again, this notion that we have overlapping S-curves is that once a firm really starts to go mainstream and starts to invest a lot in sustaining innovations to improve their current product offerings, that's when people's mainstream customer, early adopter customer needs stop being met, right? So the early markets start to take off again, because there are specific things that the general mainstream customer wants that specialists don't necessarily want. And so again, this cycle, as we talked about, this cycle of creative destruction is going on, and it never ends. And because the more you're successful at going mainstream, the more likely you are to open up the fringes of the market for new innovations to emerge. And so the key strategic lessons that we want to highlight with the S-curve is that if you're a defender, if you're an incumbent, you face a lot of difficult choices. And so if you're a company with a strong set of legacy products, how do you abandon that product which is generating so much money for you and is really the key to your success? And so some firms respond too quickly and they abandon a product too quickly because they think, oh my gosh, we're about to get disrupted with something new. And so that creates enormous sets of problems for for the companies to even figure out whether or not something that's emerging at the fringe is a legitimate threat. Then there's a time span problem, right? How quickly are some of these technologies going to be able to emerge? And so again, if you're an incumbent, you got to figure out, do you double down or do you try to do both, right? And that doing both, if you will, pursuing disruptive innovations while you're trying to maintain your competitive advantages with the legacy product. We talked about the challenges of dual transformation, but as we talked about, there's enormous difficulties around cultural barriers or political challenges internally, or even the resource dependencies that customers create for you that make it difficult for you to actually change. And so within that, right, because of the challenges incumbents face, then that creates this escalating threat, threat responses. And so, firms basically have to figure out, are they going to maintain the status quo? And so early on, you see a lot of firms ignore disruptive innovations, particularly because they're not seeing much diffusion, because the new S-curve isn't necessarily kicking off yet. But then when that product starts to grow and you start to see a new product category or a new disruption value network being developed, then there's this whole challenge of attacking, right, where you put this direct assault on the attacker to try to put them out of business or to undermine the new product line or value network that's emerging. Kind of the third stage, right, is this co-optation strategy, where oftentimes that's where companies are buying or acquiring the attackers, or they're using some other kind of alliance strategy to gain access. And so here you see, some capitulation, if you will. Firms stop attacking what's being driven up through their market with the new S-curve, and they start trying to figure out how they can take advantage of it. And the fourth stage really is that acquiescence, right, where the firm starts to, or gives up its attempt for dual transformation, abandons legacy products, and shifts to the new product, right? Or maybe even potentially leapfrog to a new set of technologies. And so S-curve, again, because they're overlapping, create an enormous set of challenges for firms of making the right strategic decisions in the right time frame in order to maintain long-term viability. And new entrants have some advantages in that. And so again, early on, they can have an undivided focus, and that hyper-specialization is what allows many new entrants to gain traction with innovators and early adopter customers. And so again, because they're able to really focus in on those particular unmet needs that these customers have, that gives them an enormous advantage to be able to focus in on just those specialized product features. Also can give them access to new talent, some freedom, right, from those resource dependencies that we highlighted. And new entrants oftentimes don't have to deal with the same problems with value networks or bureaucracy that firms, legacy firms in that space particularly have. But again, the question is, do they have the resources in order to drive growth up that new S-curve? And as we talked about, attackers' advantages don't always work out. Just because you can specialize and focus on a new product line doesn't mean you have the means and the capacity to be successful. And so, new entrants, again, lack some or have some real challenges because they lack diversification, right? They've got a specialized set of products that are focused on particular customer needs or problems, and that diversification, a lack of diversification, can create some challenges overall if the firm basically gets bypassed even by other entrants who have superior technologies. And lack of history sometimes makes them chasing opportunities too quickly before those opportunities really flesh out. And so there's a real significant risk that you'd waste resources, within the firm. And the third challenge is, again, building stakeholders and building that new value network, given the resource constraints that you have. This is a crucial challenge for many companies because, again, they've got to rebuild the value network around this new S-curve, around this new technology or this innovation platform that's emerging. And so collectively, these challenges create an enormous set of obstacles for firms. And so all in all, right, this innovation diffusion pattern that results or is reflected in the S-curve is really at the heart of the strategic challenges that we're discussing this semester. And as we kind of laid out in this particular lecture, the choices that we make now and how do we reach customers are going to be crucial in figuring and helping us figure out if we can move, if we're an incumbent, move from the old platform to the new platform. So that circle there, more of an oval there in the middle, right? That's the key strategic challenge that we want to start with here. Is that if we're a company that's has a legacy product that's starting to kind of fizzle out, it's at a mature phase, and now we're facing the challenge of new disruptions emerging. How do we then move from one S-curve pattern to the other, and what role do customers play in shaping that process? And so, again, the heart of this unit is thinking about this notion of crossing the chasm, right, and moving from early markets back into mainstream markets as we approach.